Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City, and I'm with you every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. on MNN. The show is repeated every Thursday evening on MNN4, also at 8 p.m. Those of you who have been following us on the Radical Imagination realize by now that a major concern of the show has been about preserving and critiquing a collective progressive memory. We want to imagine how that tradition might manifest and express itself today in an America deeply divided and yet united in an impatience, revulsion, and fury toward a system they agree is no longer working for them. More than one political pundit this past week, when commenting on the Sanders campaign, referred to the Port Huron Statement, the iconic document written in 1962 that became the foundation for the New Left movement of the 1960s. In the same breath, they wondered when the lyrics of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, the iconic band of Woodstock Nation, would be appearing in one of Bernie's campaign ads. One can only imagine that their worst fears are that Bernie wins, takes the oath of office as the 45th president, and is sworn in laying his hand on the Port Huron Statement rather than the Bible. And for their part, and for what it's worth, Crosby, Stills, and Nash's words ring as true today as they did back in the 60s. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. Think it's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn again. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong again. Young people speaking their minds once again. So much resistance from behind. Think it's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Well, we decided to stop a bit too and look at what's going down with our guest tonight. Because of the intense interest and response we had to our first show with him, he's back to continue our critique of the New Left and SDS during the 60s and its possible continued relevance today. Todd Gitlin was in the forefront of the New Left movement of the 60s, serving as SDS president in 1963 and 1964. He's the author of 15 major books, hundreds of articles, and dozens of publications, and is now a professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the Ph.D. program in communications at Columbia University. So welcome, Todd. Once again, it's terrific to have you back and carrying on with our discussion.
Hey, Jim.
How you doing? How you doing, Todd? So, Todd, tell me a little bit about the emotional draw of the New Left. The turmoil, the challenges, the emotionality that you face as a young kid.
It was a complicated bundle of feelings. One was certainly severe anger, outrage at the continued subjection of black Americans and the terror that prevailed in the Deep South as the civil rights movement began to demand its due. Anger at the extremities of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, anger at the complacency of most Americans and most of our exalted institutions, including the universities, which most of us came from. So on the one hand, outrage. Secondly, a kind of anguish about the lives that have been laid out for us. We've been promised comfort. We're affluent. We're as affluent as all get out. Getting more affluent all the time, and at the same time, a kind of hollowness, a kind of blankness of meaning, stagnation, and there was a strong feeling on the part of, I should add or underscore, relatively few people, that this was not a worthy existence that was being laid out for us, that there had to be more than the standard package of consumer goods, the house in the suburbs, the nuclear family, and so on. And then I would say also coexisting with the outrage was hope, was a kind of faith in the energy that could be distilled. I mean, I think one of the strong features of the New Left was something that maybe has become obvious since then, but it was kind of remarkable at the time. It's not only what we thought; it's that is what we thought we could do with what we thought. Action.
Participation.
Direct action.
In the society, yeah.
Direct action in overcoming injustice, changing the world by just picking up and changing it. So the remarkable thing about the sit-in movement that erupted in the South on February 1st, 1960, it was not simply that there were some students who opposed segregation. A lot of people opposed segregation. They actually undertook to abolish it here and now. Okay, you go in you sit down at a lunch counter where you're banned, and you just, by that stroke of your action, you abolish segregation. You say, well, it's no more here. We're here.
Wasn't an intellectual exercise. Moral outrage that manifests itself in direct action.
That's right. Moral outrage that is in the world, not simply beholding, not simply a spectator stance, but an activity where you flourish, you take risks, and you feel that you're living in history. That there's a relation also to between your personal troubles and your public issues, as C. Wright Mills, the sociologist, put it.
But you came from somewhat humble background, right? You were
middle class.
Okay, and you had expectations. Your folks had expectations for you that you bought into to a certain extent.
Not much.
Not really. Not much.
I mean, the expectations of normality were there. They were in the woodwork.
Right.
I mean, I took them to be normal. I wasn't excited about having a career as a mathematician, which was the destiny that I was more or less on track for.
That's what you majored in as an undergraduate. Yeah.
Yeah,
right?
and I was being courted by the Navy to help them do military research. I could have gone normal. I was in on very early computer development when a computer was. I helped program a computer that was going to be about this size, and it had 4 operations hardwired into it. It could add, subtract, multiply. It could add, subtract, shift left, which means multiply by 10, or shift right, divide by 10. And my job was to teach it to do everything else. It had its total storage of, if I remember correctly, 4K. That just bored me out of my gourd. I found the people I was working with banal, and meantime, the world was happening, and the world was both menacing and inspiring. And I wanted to live larger than I could live in that minuscule world. So I'm part escape from the parochialism of second-generation immigrants. In part, sort of a lust to come to grips with what had happened in the world, the World War II, to the atomic bomb, inspiration by the philosophical figures who came out of the French Resistance, a sense of, we were called to, all those who could see the world this way, were called to take the big world seriously and not pretend. Not leave it to the dead hands who were steering it.
Who were trying to make you into sort of a robot.
And not just me. I mean, their world was not only a world of injustice, but it was also a suffocating world. It was also a boring world.
And the need to hook up with other people who were feeling that way too was absolutely essential.
Yeah.
So
community
and association.
It was almost fashionable to feel estranged. Estrangement had reached into popular culture via figures like James Dean and Marlon Brando. The Beats were hovering nearby with their revulsion. at the sort of the blandness and fatuousness of everything. The trick was to find a way to live differently, and you had to do that in company. You had to do that with people who were like-minded. So it happened. A lot of such people began to appear. I mean, by today's standards or any later standards, it was not a lot of people. It was.
Now, when you say began to appear,
well, they're on camp. I mean, first of all, they appear in the civil rights movement.
Okay, and you went to these demonstrations and so on, and you were.
And they appear in what came to be the peace movement.
Right. Okay.
And we're talking about tiny numbers of people. Right. 5 people here, 10 people there. SDS, when I became president, had, I think, 1,500 members nationally, had maybe 20 chapters. It was interesting, though, that they were not, they were all over the place. I mean, yeah, you expect to find, radical young people in New York, or maybe even on a campus like Harvard, or at the University of Michigan, where SDS started, University of Wisconsin, and so on. But SDS was also cropping up at the University of Texas. It was cropping up in small Midwestern colleges. So it wasn't hard to feel that there was, something was on the move, although what it was not exactly
something
clear.
Happening here. Yes, we weren't sure. Did you do much traveling? You went to these campuses and help organize, speak, demonstrate, get arrested. What was happening with you?
Well, I was when I got involved in the peace movement. There was a New England-wide connections were made, conferences were held, demonstrations were jointly organized. When there were national civil rights activities, my first arrest was on July 4th, a civil rights demonstration to integrate the amusement park right outside Baltimore. Actually twice, and a lot of people came and got arrested in that behalf. I mean, it wasn't by no means on the scale of danger that civil rights workers were facing in the South, but it was a place where you could sort of feel your communal existence. You could sort of feel it's something in the air that was off the chart. That was. It was not prepackaged.
So would you call it?
I got around and I saw people here and I saw people there, and that was always kind of exciting. You go to some place where you've never been before and you meet somebody. This happened to me numbers of times. You'd meet somebody, it might be the head of the local chapter, and you sort of discover you want to stay up all night and talk, and they had a lot to talk about. Somebody who was utterly unlike you. I remember. Giving talks about the Vietnam War in 1965. I went to Tulsa and Norman, Oklahoma. I went to Columbia, Missouri, back in the news recently. University of Kansas, Lawrence. And in all these places, I would meet people who felt like friends. The University of Missouri was a guy who was somewhat older than me. He'd actually been a soldier in the Korean War. He was politically radical, very good writer. And sort of suddenly there we were. It was a little kind of magical.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And having gone through it myself, I resonate with what you're saying. But when did we fully realize we were in a movement, rather than just sort of associating with like-minded people and having some interesting adventures? When did this become somewhat serious, in a sense, or challenge to the dominant establishment?
But it probably happened differently for different people, but the sense that there was a movement, I remember striking me as, whoa, that's an interesting way to think about it, and self-fulfilling actually, because if enough people think they are a movement, then they are.
There it is.
That was happening around 1963, and I think the language was borrowed from the civil rights movement. Although there were, one became aware that there were tendrils of the old left that had also referred to themselves once upon a time as the movement. There was a certain style that was available. A lot of my awareness, and I think a lot of people's awareness that there was a movement, actually came through popular culture. Through the radio, through rock and roll,
Begins with the counterculture, folk music.
Well, nobody used the term counterculture. It was, it was. There was sort of another way of feeling. There was another way there were values that were not honored in the mainstream culture, although you could find shadows of them here or there. But they were, you felt energized and emboldened by whenever you discovered that there were people who sort of talked your talk, and there they were, singing songs on the radio. There was Joan Baez, there was Bob Dylan. Wow, we're on the charts. That was a big gratification.
Yeah. Were you overseas as well? Did you travel?
No,
So it was mainly around.
I went to Cuba
States.
Briefly at the end of 1967, but aside from a quick trip to Montreal, also in 1967, I was domestic.
So, this intellectual and emotional fervor, how did it manifest itself in your role in SDS there?
Chaotically.
Chaotically. But what direction were you trying to grapple with in terms of how the organization should respond to this or that?
Let me say first of all, I was 20 years old. I didn't have very formed ideas about what SDS ought to do. I had not been in it very long. I was elected president because nobody else who knew the organization better wanted to run. I mean, so it gave me a whiff of the informality, the sort of horizontalism of the culture that was building up. But fine. I think what was so I didn't feel I was acting as an individual. There were a group of us in Ann Arbor who were, virtually, living on top of each other and trying to think collectively. And the way the thoughts ran then were as follows: the civil rights movement in the South, against great obstacles, is actually going to win. It's going to win not only because Kennedy is, by fits and starts, come to take it seriously, but it's going to win because the old order is fading. The racist Democratic Party has seen its glory days behind it. There are going to be reforms, and so the civil rights movement now is poised to win reforms in the law and reforms in practices. It's going to end segregation. But now what? And so the hope of a number of people, including SDS, but also the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was that the energy that had been unleashed against racism had to be turned against class injustice. That there needed to be an interracial movement of the poor, in which students would play a certain part as galvanizers. And the thought was something like this: there would be this poor people's movement. We would help catalyze it, and we would also be an element of the cement that would hold it together with more traditional liberals who were who had those who had supported Adlai Stevenson in his efforts for president, those who were doing local reforms. We saw ourselves not as the totality of a movement, but as elements in its enlargement. That was something of the guiding idea, and it all made perfect sense.
Yeah.
It was stupendously ambitious.
Working on the margins, but not giving up on trying to impact the system as such.
Yeah, we thought the system was not static. We thought the system was
Okay.
in the process of adaptation. In fact, that was a major theme in the Port Huron Statement. The Port Huron Statement, its real contribution was in the statement of values, but most of the document was devoted to social criticism and also to an observation about what was happening in the mainstream. That the old mainstream stagnation was actually getting its comeuppance, and in part because it was defunct. It was a zombie formation. It was ideologically bankrupt. It was unsatisfying to the people involved in it. So it's worth. I mean, it's an interesting analysis. A lot of what the Port Huron Statement said there was true. There was. It wasn't just we were changing; the times were changing, and. So we thought there was actually going to be a place for us somewhere on the fringe of the mainstream. We didn't know exactly what that fringe was going to look like. So we wanted to be, we felt urgent. That was an important word in the Port Huron Statement. But we also felt relevant, that somehow we were not just babbling out there on the side, speaking our private language. We wanted to be relevant. We actually wanted reforms. We wanted other people to be energized, and we thought that there was a process at work, and it would take a very long time to move toward a more livable, a more egalitarian, a more participatory society. But that's what we were going to do.
And as you said at the very beginning there, the central importance of values.
Yeah.
Just flesh that out a little bit. What do you mean by that in terms of morality, spiritual progressives? What do you mean by the values? That right was on your side? And
we were political, but not only political.
Okay.
I mean, we thought there was a hollow heart at the core of the culture, and that was dismaying and unacceptable. So we saw ourselves as a sort of revival. Later, there were a few historians, a man named McLaughlin, for one, wrote an interesting book on the history of America's Great Awakenings. Sort of arguably, the Puritan movement in England is an awakening. It's a religious awakening. There's the so-called Great Awakening that took place in the 18th century. And in the run-up to the American Revolution, there was the awakening of the early 19th century, which was a religious movement. It led to religious revival, but also led to the women's suffrage movement and abolitionism. And then there was another religious revival around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, which much of which had a right-wing cast. It was anti-alcohol, anti-sex or anti-prostitution and so on. So it could be argued, McLaughlin argued, that actually what happened in the 60s was yet another awakening. That is to say, it had this dimension of wanting to transform not the culture. Yeah, we wanted to change institutions and policies, but it was more than that. I mean, we didn't. I wasn't aware of anybody thinking of it that way in the early 1960s.
Right,
but
right.
In retrospect, I think that's actually a reasonable way to look at it. We were a renewal movement, so we had a face that cared about music. We had a face that cared about revamping dead religious denominations. We had a wing that cared about transforming sort of the structure of relationships, which led toward egalitarianism between the sexes and sexualities and so on. We believed in a kind of directness of address. We were anti-authoritarian.
Hierarchical,
yeah. So all that was what we were about, and so yeah, it was hard to get your mind around what this was, if you weren't in it. But when you were in it, you felt that some other kind of life had opened up. The country
more alive.
It was a moral life, but it was also cultural life. We were going to have fun in a different way.
Yeah.
I think youth tend to think they're going to have fun in a way that nobody ever had before, and as if they've invented sex and so on. This was not just talking through our hats. There had been what had settled into the country was a kind of suffocation, a kind of next door neighbor, white picket fence, Ozzie and Harriet, father knows best mentality, and that was a drag. That was deadening. And, we were dancing, we were going to do drugs, and so on.
Right. Did you find any aid in this transformation, if you want to call it that, with you personally, from your Jewish background, or did that play any role, do you think, in awareness or idealism or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, I wasn't. I went to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvahed. I was not Judaic. That pretty much fell away. All the traces of it fell away when I was still in my teens. But I was mindful of the tradition of Jewish justice fights, and I was certainly mindful, as many people I knew were, and even people who weren't Jewish were mindful of the hideousness of the mass murder of the Jews in Europe. That was a shadow over us. So is this what history has come to? And so, yeah, of course, Jews felt it. In a different way. It may be hard to believe from today's vantage point when the Holocaust is a capitalized word. It's in the dictionary. Nobody talked about the Holocaust when I was growing up. My grandmother, who'd lost much of her family in Lithuania, we talk about the war and the war. It was the war. It was Hitler and the war. The first book first big best-selling books that touched on it, both fiction and nonfiction, were not published until the late 50s, early 60s. There were no courses on the Holocaust and so on. So it had a kind of outside, hovering existence, a kind of brooding presence, and I felt that, and I felt it, personally in a way, but I took it to be not just a Jewish problem. I took the capacity of humanity to destroy itself and to destroy its others was now a big fat human fact. It was new in history, and anti-Semitism obviously wasn't new, but the capacity for annihilation was new, and so it was not hard to find some sort of affinity between the dangers of racial supremacy and the dangers of nuclear weapons. I'm not saying it was the same issue, but
but again,
you could feel an affinity.
That was so central, right?
The way I would put it was say, life is precarious. You may
Fragile.
You may have a TV set, you may have 2 cars in the garage, but we're not headed toward perfection. We're not unfolding ourselves toward, some pinnacle of human existence. This is really, we're on a precipice here, and let's stare it in the face. If we don't know what to do about it, or we don't even know what to call it, let's at least stare it in the face. So, tradition, in America in the 20th century, most of the people who felt that the precariousness of existence were blacks and Jews. So in that sense, it was important to me that to be Jewish, and yet at the same time it was sort of a revelation to see there were people coming out of non-Jewish America who were feeling something similar, who wanted renewal.
But you would never...
I came from New York.
Right.
I went to schools where almost all the students were Jews.
Right.
Because the Catholic kids, who were half my neighborhood more or less, went to parochial school. We didn't know them at school. I went to the Bronx High School of Science, which was heavily Jewish. A lot of the teachers were Jewish. So, it was a Jewish world without making much of it. Then I find that there are people who sort of sound like me, although their vowel sounds are different, and they're from New Mexico or Texas, and so that was thrilling.
But you've never been to? Have you been to Israel? and
No.
the connection
Had
there.
I then, no.
Because you've written several pieces on Jews as a chosen people. You've written that there's a churning emotions that you have when you write about Israel and the connection there to American Judaism and your own personal feelings. I mean, what is that about, and how is that played out in the struggles of the new left, let's say?
Well, it was shocking to me in the late 60s to see that Israel had turned into, at least in some quarters of the left, had turned into a sort of a touchstone of identity, that is, negative identity. If you were signed on to the whole project, then you had to view view Israel as a colonialist excrescence. And at the same time, Israel, on the heels of its great military victory in 1967, had was becoming smug and complacent and turning to the right. So I started getting involved, and I was never central to it, but there were activists I knew coming out of the New Left who started trying to organize an alternative for American Jews who wanted Israel to be just. So I felt friendly toward those efforts. I did eventually visit Israel several times, and I never felt, I never would have called myself a Zionist, in that it seemed to me that the achievement of Zionism was, first of all, legitimate, that the Jews deserved a state, Jews deserved a homeland. Secondly, that the achievement of the state, it sort of spelled the end of Zionism. That is to say, Zionism was the commitment to create a state, and there were lots of arguments of what kind of state it should be, and others will know this history far better than I. But suffice to say that Zionism was not a galvanizing cause. I mean, I knew people for whom it was. There were even people, I knew a writer I respected greatly who picked up in 1967 and went to Israel to fight in the military against the invading armies. I was nowhere near that. I didn't understand that. But it still felt that my fate, my nature, my what would come to be called identity was somehow bound up with the ability of the Jews to secure some sort of stability and security. So when I think the real jolt, there were two jolts that hit me in the aftermath of the 1960s. Two things happened in the 70s that jarred me. One was the Yom Kippur War, which was the first time I felt that the existence of the state could not be taken for granted, and the second was the Zionism as racism resolution, which drove me crazy. I mean, I was aware that there were Zionists who were racist. I was also aware there were a whole lot of movements and forces and moods and so on that were racist and had not been singled out for execration in the United Nations. So that did not sit well with me. It sat very badly. It's what developed.
Among some of your colleagues on the left.
Well, yeah, I mean,
right?
there were people. There was certainly a current of anti-Semitism running around the Black Panther Party. I was aware of it. I found it dismaying. But as long as the Vietnam War was on, that's where the core of my political commitment was. So. But as the war was ending, I was, my view of the world was enlarging, let's say, I never felt personally, well, in no major way that I feel the presence of anti-Semitism, but I was, I wasn't stupid, and I had to be aware that, with the Zionism as racism resolution, I took personally. nobody else, the Saudis' racism was not being condemned as a crime to humanity. The anti-Semitism of the Soviet Union was not, which was utterly anti-Zionist, was not being taken seriously as a threat to humanity. So, how did Israel get to be the great Satan? I found that abominable. Still
do you find some of that same Israel bashing to an extreme today, or is it more justified, if you will, particularly on the left? Of course, as Israel's turned more toward the right.
Look, I mean, I have two cardinal principles here, and trying to reconcile them is not easy. One is that the state of Israel has a right to exist. The Jewish people are a people, whatever you want to say about the tangled nature of the history of the Jews. The Jews are a people. Were identified with some beliefs they have about something that happened and a God who spoke to them and so on. And they have the same national rights as anyone else, compounded, of course, by the fact that the Jews were despised and murdered, which meant that they had there was a special obligation that the rest of the world had to honor their experience. And so, on the one hand, the existence of the Jewish state is something that meant something to me. On the other hand, the existence of an unjust Jewish state horrifies me, and has steadily done so. So I've been involved. I've signed. I've had a nickel for every statement I've signed or article I've written. I'd have a lot of nickels. It continues to bother me greatly, as a matter of equity, that hatred of the state of Israel has become a sort of automatic touchstone of left-wing identity. It's a sort of like an anti-loyalty oath one has to take. Yeah. So one is not required to loathe the prison camps of China. One is not required to have any view at all about the slaughter of people in Congo. One is not required to have any particular position about the mistreatment of indigenous peoples in Brazil or Ecuador. But one is required to hate Israel. It's the hate that I hate.
Yeah, I understand.
So that's why I'm actively opposed to the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Although I am for boycotts of settlement goods, and I am for political pressure on this horrible Israeli government.
Okay.
But I'm against all academic boycotts. In fact, I've become now an honorary professor at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, so that if I'm invited to an international conference, I will. I'll either require the inviters to disinvite me if they think that Israeli professors are demonic, or to reconsider whatever sort of thick-headed and basically racist policies they're pursuing, in singling out Israel as the one country in the world that should not be published, that whose professors should not be talked to, and so on. I consider that loathsome, and I'm willing to put my body on that particular line. But but I spend a lot of time writing. I just spent most of today writing a piece denouncing the government of Israel, and I put a lot of energy into such denunciations. I mean, the politics of the state of Israel appall me. I feel very connected to very brave people who fight for justice for Palestinians, or for some kind of livable two-state or something two-state-ish sort of solution. I mean, to me, those people are heroic. They're under fire. They're being blacklisted by tolerated right-wing organizations.
Right.
These people killed the prime minister of Israel 20 years ago. probably the most effective assassination of modern times, I would say, since the assassination of Gandhi, anyway. The inheritors of that, of the victory in that civil war, are still in power. So I take it personally. Yeah, it bugs.
I understand.
It bothers me. It bothers me very, very greatly.
Well, understood.
To put it
Understood
mildly.
very much. Coming back to assassinations and the new left in America and the connections today, what do you see happening in the Sanders movement? The assassination, of course, of the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, as a way of diluting the power of the new left. What do you see happening here? What are some connections to the present day energy on campus among young people?
Well, the energy is real. I mean, I think the energy behind the Sanders, I think it's fair to say there's a Sanders movement. It's not clear where it'll go.
Right.
It's great that it exists. It's great that there's an outside movement. I mean, the problem, one of the big problems for social movements is what's the relationship between outside energy and inside energy? Always that is a problem that has to be faced. It had to be faced by the civil rights movement. It had to be faced by the anti-war movement. It had to be faced by the women's movement. It had to be faced, it's now being faced by the Black Lives Matter movement. And it comes with the territory. It's a structured problem.
Absolutely.
So the Sanders movement is really very interesting. Here's a guy who's steadfastly not been a Democrat. He resisted advice to become a Democrat. He always ran as an outsider. He became mayor. He built a political machine that worked. No Democrat has ever done what he was able to do. Now, it's a niche achievement. That is, to say, it's not. You can't replicate it elsewhere. Burlington, Vermont has 42,000 citizens. You could be a hands-on, participatory, inventive mayor of Burlington in a way that it's unimaginable that you could do in Chicago or Los Angeles. He really transformed politics there. So I'm very excited that he's on the charts. I think he's done a world of good to the Democrats. But the problem always remains. How does an outsider movement continue to stay in business without rendering itself irrelevant or worse? When I say worse, I'm talking about Ralph Nader and that his expediting the coup d'etat that took place in America in 2000. There was an Obama movement too in 2008, and the stadiums rocked, and the young people turned out, and there were hopes for some continuation of that movement.
But Obama never pretended to be an outside. Or did he?
He fuzzed it. He fuzzed it.
He fuzzed it.
I mean, remember, he was only
on.
on the political charts because he'd opposed the war.
Right. Okay.
The Iraq War, and yeah, he had people in his camp who were veterans of 1960s movements, who believed in some continuing kind of transformational movement that would keep pushing, and the mainstream Democrats pulled the plug on that operation. So yeah, I'd say the hope side of the Obama spirit. It was something of a blank slate onto which you could read a big transformation. And
do you worry about the same thing possibly?
Yes, I do. I do. I worry
the
about
organizational structure.
Yeah, because the left is always suspicious of power. This is not a problem for the right.
Certainly, you were when you were 20, right?
I certainly was,
yes.
And I still am. I'm ambivalent. Okay. But somebody's got to do it. Meantime, Ted Cruz isn't ambivalent about power.
Right.
Jeb Bush isn't. Rubio's not ambivalent about power. All the people that run the states, thanks to their tremendous success in redistricting, in lobbying, in accepting plutocrats' money, they now run. They have 30 or 31 governors of the states. They run something like that number of legislatures. They roll up their sleeves and they get to work, and they may hiss and whine and bitch at their leaders, but the thing is that they show up. They show up at the polls. They show up for policy. Our people are not so disciplined. Our people want to have a better time. Our people want want to perfect difference. We want to perfect collisions over race, sex, sexuality, class, religion, and so on. Because there's a purist spirit, which is puritanical and is destructive. This is a very big country. All politics to matter are coalition politics, must be coalition politics. There is no super, this is a nation of minorities. And if they don't see past their difference, if they stop perfecting their difference, only if they stop perfecting their differences, only if they can actually act constructively by enfolding difference into a spirit
Some
of
sort
commonality.
of new realignment, right? A new realignment of the Democratic Party. Is that what you think needs to happen?
The Democratic Party is going to continue to be a big tent because there's no way, that I can see that a Bernie Sanders type movement is going to become the Democratic Party of Missouri, or of Nebraska, or of Alabama. Okay. I mean, it's if it's possible that he could win in a national election under certain circumstances, he's still not going to sweep the Congress. I mean, there's a deep conservatism in this country on the part of people and their funders who could not be more serious about winning. And our people sometimes would rather lose. There are plenty of people on the other side who will be happy to accommodate.
So it's rooted in economic privilege, above all else, in the sense that he called for possible guaranteed annual income or national one-payer health insurance. That's just something that will never happen or not happen at this moment, this political moment. Do you think that's possible within the structure of the Democratic Party?
I think there could...
Or some sort of end to poverty in some way, some sort of redistribution of wealth from the bottom up.
I think certain redistributive policies are feasible.
Okay.
I do, because the stupendous inequality that has become normal is also infuriating to a large majority of people. Most people do not want Warren Buffett to pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. Most people, a majority of Americans do not want to see people going without health care. A majority of Americans want to see education affordable, want to see the worst of poverty at least overridden and ended, want to see police more reasonable and less brutal. I think, if the constellations are in alignment, it's conceivable that there could be very substantial reforms. Look, the world economy ran over a cliff not so long ago. It's now 9 years. It's in the memory of people. People understand, a lot of people, especially young people, understand how precarious normal existence is. There are reforms that are quite conceivable about the governance, for example, of corporations. How can it be that self-perpetuating boards of directors get to make enormous decisions about where jobs should be located and that sort of thing? I think it's conceivable that we can see constructive, progressive measures in the states, as we've seen, for example, on climate change matters. The states, the Northeast and California, are way in advance of where much of the country is, and have actually had a good deal to do with goosing Obama to accelerate policies that come to grips with climate change. So there's a lot of energy in this old duck, and I don't have a map for how that energy gets
Well,
expressed.
neither did you have it when you were a young kid either.
Well,
so
do
you think the young movement today has?
I thought I knew a lot more at 20 than I think I know it now.
Now, okay, but Do you see them, what's happening now among the young people, as some sort of connection to what you experience also, and I experienced in the
Well,
early
I mean, there's certain real commonality. You know,
and lessons that the left, the new left, can give.
I mean, there's certainly a revulsion against racism, which
Okay.
which is familiar.
Yes.
There's certainly opposition to war, opposition to the most belligerent foreign policy. There's certainly a hatred of abuse of power, a hatred of violence, whether it's violence against women or violence against black people or against immigrants. Those values are fresh and might even be said to be enduring. These are enduring American values. They're not the only ones, but you know, we have a long history with the fight against illegitimate power, whether it's the power of slave owners or the power of plutocratic capitalists. All those are alive. But the energy has to be focused. You know, for example.
What about that emptiness you talked about, the apathy that you had experienced as a young kid, the wanting to live?
It's always there.
You find it's among the young people that you teach as well as I teach.
think most people in America
moral numbness.
Yeah, I think most people in America want to live private lives. They don't feel the calling to citizenship. There are fluctuations, but we tend to think somebody else should do it. And you know, the victories of the right have meant that the existence of unions is in jeopardy. And in the mid-50s, about a third of the American workforce belonged to a union. Today, it's 10-ish%, and in the private workforce, it's 7-8%. There can be no solidarity that matters unless there's solidarity across class lines in behalf of the majority of people who have very little property, who are dependent on wages and salaries, and whose political and economic futures are tenuous because they don't make the decisions about what gets made and where and how. So I would like to see it's great that there are students who work with sweatshop workers. I'd like to see an extrapolation of that sort of principle. I think there needs to be, I'd like to see more people coming out of the universities going to work with unions. There are some, there are many, they do good work. We need more of that. Not all virtue is to be found on Wall Street.
Absolutely. Well, the struggle goes on. Todd, thank you so much for being here and discussing this with us. The Port Huron Statement was written and the New Left developed during a period of American history when most serious political scientists and their mass media counterparts believed that America had resolved and solved the pressing political, economic, and cultural issues of the day. We as a society had moved into an end of ideology and conflict, and all that fundamentally needed to happen was to enjoy the fruits of the American dream that had become an eternal reality for peace and harmony. It didn't take long for that to be proven hopelessly wrong. Historically situated in early 1960s America, Port Huron and the New Left, springing from younger people on college campuses who matured in the post-war world, drew on a variety of progressive traditions and collective memories to become a living conversation that was a beginning dialogue with the larger society. As Tom Hayden, the principal author, put it, the statement itself was revised but never voted on by the convention. It was approved as a living document, and in a sense, the Port Huron Statement wrote us. It was like an orchestra, many instruments and many voices. The New Left did not intend to remain on the margins, but tried to represent what it thought were the mainstream needs of the great majority of American society. To build that progressive majority and coalition would eventually mean a progressive government elected to office. The counterattacks were furious and came in many forms, including murders and assassinations of many people who might have been leading figures in that National Progressive Coalition. Certainly, there were enough self-destructive tendencies within the progressive left as well. But the point is, and the point is for all of us today, to realize that great numbers of Americans, mainly young, but certainly not all, had found in the movement a radical imagination and a radical love, a life worth living, and a purpose worth dying for. Starting with a relatively small number, perhaps several hundred activists, they arguably achieved more in a shorter period of time than any previous or subsequent generation of American radicals, and became for many a source for further creative imagination and conscience. Certainly much inspiration for this show comes from their struggle. Bernie Sanders, when he's inaugurated as president in January of 2017, may not put his hand on the statement when being sworn in, but it's safe to say he will have a well-worn copy of it close at hand. We hope that many young people and all Americans join in that struggle. And thank you so much, Todd Gitlin, for being here on the show, sharing your love and energy, and for being such a major creative part of this struggle. And much radical love sent out to my co-host, Stanley Aronowitz, wishing you the speediest return to good health. We all can't wait to have your indomitable spirit and force of leftist nature back on the show. Thank you all for watching this evening's show. Thank you, Todd Gitlin, and see you next week on The Radical Imagination.